This may surprise some of you, but we're going to jump into the New Testament for this edition of Biblical Insights. Jesus, of course, was described as a teacher, as a rabbi in many places throughout the Gospels. I have just a couple up on the screen for you from Mark chapter 9, Matthew 26, and Matthew chapter 8. However, Jesus' contemporaries realized something. Jesus is not your average rabbi. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 7, when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. Now, Jesus, as one who taught with authority, gets himself into some trouble with some of the local Jewish authorities. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus is questioned, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." He answered them, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" Now, I have the tradition of the elders and the commandment of God in bold because I want to draw attention to those phrases. The tradition of the elders refers to the oral law. This later developed into the incredibly, extremely, excruciatingly detailed regulations of the Mishnah. And Jesus here elaborates on his argument further. You can read more into it if you want, but he tells them how these traditions were actually in conflict with the intent of God's law. Now, one thing that's very interesting is that we can go into the Mishnah and we can get sort of a behind-the-scenes look at why Jesus got himself and his disciples sometimes in so much trouble with the Jewish authorities. So we're going to jump into the Mishnah now. This may be unfamiliar territory, and it's a bit of a strange place in some cases. I'll be citing from a translation of the Mishnah. However, I'm going to include links, and I'll put all of this information, everything that you see on the screen, in a pinned comment, so that you can go there and you can look at the online version, though it'll be a little different from what you're seeing on the screen. So we'll talk about some of these places in the Mishnah that intersect with some of the times that Jesus got in trouble, and then we'll build towards a significant theological conclusion. All right, Matthew chapter 9. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? All right, so we find Jesus here eating in a house that, according to Jewish tradition, would be declared unclean because of the tax collectors. From the Mishnah, tax collectors who enter the house, it's unclean, and Jesus, we find, is eating with these tax collectors and sinners. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. Now, of course, doing work on the Sabbath is prohibited according to the Mosaic law. However, what does that actually mean? What does doing work on the Sabbath mean? Well, the oral tradition and then the Mishnah sought to answer that question, and they came up with all of these regulations. Back to the Mishnah, there are acts of labor prohibited on the Sabbath, and there are actually 39 of them. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to read all 39 of them. We only have to get to number 3. Reaping is prohibited on the Sabbath. This is what we find Jesus and his disciples doing. They're breaking the traditions, and once again, they get in trouble for it. Now let's jump to a theologically significant one, and we'll end our exploration of the Mishnah with this. But two who are sitting, and words of the Torah do pass between them, the presence is with them. If two people are sitting, they're reading the Torah, reciting the Torah, talking about the Torah, the presence, that is the divine presence, is with them. Now, what did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 18? For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Do you see the relationship here? According to the tradition, if you had 2 people reading the Torah, reciting the Torah, the divine presence was with them. Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. What kind of rabbi would teach like this? What kind of rabbi would substitute his name for the Torah? What kind of rabbi would substitute his presence for the divine presence? That's exactly what Jesus has done. But now for the careful reader of Matthew, this is no surprise. Way back in Matthew chapter 1, we read, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So we shouldn't be surprised what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 18. He's simply picking up a theme that began way back in Matthew chapter 1. And this theme is just as loud and clear in Mark's prologue and John's prologue as well. Jesus was claiming to be what the gospel writers said he was. And he was claiming to be what the prophets said he would be as well, the divine presence returning to dwell once again with his people. And so, in this verse in Matthew chapter 1, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So Matthew chapter 1, these couple of verses go right along with our text in Matthew 18:20, talking about the divine presence being among his people. There's a theological continuum that stretches between the two and goes beyond. Not only is Matthew chapter 1 appropriate for our background here to Matthew 18, but it's appropriate for this time of year, which here in the West, as well as many places around the world, is Christmas. We're getting very close to it. So at the risk of dating this video for future viewers, I do wish you a Merry Christmas. Thanks for watching.